You are suddenly taken out of all the concrete and all the cars, and you are transported into this little piece of our predecessors' landscape.
This is Five Places, Los Angeles, a living documentary of the city produced by the LA Forum for Architecture and Urban Design. I'm Emmanuelle Bourrier, and in each episode, I ask one interviewee about the 5 places that define Los Angeles for them. Today, I'm thrilled to share my interview with Frances Anderton, who is well known and loved in the Los Angeles design world for her many years as host of the KCRW public radio show, DNA, Design and Architecture, as well as for her thoughtful and inclusive stance as a commentator, moderator, and curator of all things design. Most recently, she has published a book, Common Ground, Multifamily Housing in Los Angeles. Frances is also a dear friend of mine, as we were longtime neighbors in one of the buildings she writes about in her book. One of the many things I love about Frances is her dedication to using her bike as a mode of transport, even in her hilly neighborhood, as she was getting ready to do when we caught up on a cold December afternoon.
Well, Frances, I want to thank you so much. It's a particular thrill to interview you because so many of us have learned so much about Los Angeles from your show on KCRW, Design and Architecture, which ran for so many years, and through all of your wonderful events and shows that you've moderated and curated, and now, of course, through your book on multifamily housing in Los Angeles, which I will link to.
Well, Emmanuelle, let me say, first of all, that you obviously, as a great friend and one-time neighbor, have absolutely enriched my experience of Los Angeles. And also, thank you so much for asking me to talk to you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Frances. Let's dive in. I'll combine my first 2 questions. How long have you lived in LA, and what brought you to LA?
We are talking at the end of 2022, and I moved here in June of 1991. And I moved here 4 years after my first visit to Los Angeles, which was very long ago, before some of your listeners were probably born, which was 1987. And I came here really out of a bunch of happenstance that came together. I went to architecture school. While at architecture school, I came to the realization that I had more gifts in the sort of communications terrain, and I wound up becoming an assistant editor immediately after the Bartlett for the Architectural Review magazine, based in London. The Architectural Review magazine was run by a very colourful character, sadly now passed, called Peter Davey. And I think I'd been there for about 6 weeks or so, and Peter Davey came in to see me. I was just barely finding my feet, and basically said, Anderton, we have a problem, special issue on young Americans that we need to fill, need you to do it. And basically what had happened was the Architecture Review published 12 issues a year, and it had made a plan to publish a special issue on young American architects in December of 1987. And the part of the plan was that the then famed and now late architecture critic Michael Sorkin was going to be the guest editor. Well, it turned out that this arrangement had been made over what we know in England as a liquid lunch, as in a lunch involving drinking a rather large amount of alcohol. And over this liquid lunch, Peter Davey and Michael Sorkin had apparently made a handshake agreement that he would be the guest editor on this issue. And subsequently, all memory had vanished of this. So all of a sudden, Peter found himself with an issue in the pipeline and no editor to take care of it. So he basically dropped it on me and told me to look into young American architects. Well, I wound up instead coming to Los Angeles and focusing that special issue on new work by the sort of then subversive anti-establishment architects who are now the establishment, Frank Gehry, Tom Main, Eric Owen Moss, Craig Hodgetts, and wound up, meeting all those guys, staying with this woman who became a great friend, Julia Bloomfield, who introduced me to lots of people in the architecture world in LA. I came to LA, I just thought it was a very strange place in terms of its car dependence and sprawl and low rise, where the houses seem to be smaller than the trees that kind of dotted across the landscape. And yeah, I found this amazing creativity going on here at a time when on the East Coast and in Europe, there was a preoccupation with postmodernism, and in England, high-tech architecture. And here you had this really fresh, original take on a kind of response to modernism, but I wouldn't call it postmodernism per se. And I just found it incredibly interesting and enticing and vowed to come back. And that's what I did. I moved here in 1991.
And it's amazing. Some of the elements of that story have evolved quite a bit. On a rather humorous note, a liquid lunch in LA now is a detox green juice.
Right.
And you did this this issue on all the young architects who were mostly guys, I guess, which would be probably different today. At the time, I think it was very much
it was pretty male dominant.
A man's world.
I mean, yeah. At the time, there were definitely couples. There was Craig and Ming, and there were some couples, but yes, primarily it was generally a very male-dominated arena. Absolutely. Although I will say that, I stayed with this woman, Julia Bloomfield, who, became absolutely one of my best women friends and was herself sort of headhunted to come and head up publications at the Getty Research Institute. And sort of through Julia and actually through various leads, I did meet what I felt were very powerful women. For example, April Greiman, the graphic designer who I met a little bit later, she's an amazing force. Deborah Sussman, amazing forces in graphic design in the 1980s. I met them pretty soon after that first trip, and that's just two people. There were many others. So I've always felt LA's been a pretty great place for women, actually, women professionals. Even though some will say there's been many obstacles and bumps in the road, it felt like a great place to be a woman practitioner.
And you stayed, and you have a marvelous story about hearing Warren Olney on the radio and deciding that you wanted to be a part of that, and actually going and becoming a part of his show, Which Way LA, and subsequently To the Point.
That's right. Yes. No, I was very much in the architecture world. When I arrived in 1991, I was editing actually AIA LA's local newsletter. It was what got me my start in Los Angeles. And then 11 months after I moved here, April of 1992, the city was convulsed by the civil unrest. And that was a profoundly transformative experience, I think, for many of us in the architecture world, that understood that one had to think about architecture far, far beyond its kind of formal parameters and really understand, I guess, its urban, political kind of implications, all of which has been much intensified in recent years with even sort of greater understanding of housing policies that had racial intent and infrastructure development, and that so divided people by race and class. And so anyway, we certainly got some inklings of that with the civil unrest. And yes, Which Way LA, the radio program, started, and I heard that show, and it was this incredible dialogue that Warren was moderating between people of all different backgrounds, representing all different interest groups and stakeholders, and holding forth on kind of the causes, the underpinnings of the civil unrest. And it was just such a revelation, this program, this way of having a conversation and really educating people through bringing them into multiple perspectives on aspects of Los Angeles, whether it was the mini malls that had too many liquor stores that caused, such frustrations in South LA, or the condition of schools, or all manner of things having to do with development and politics. And it was just an incredible show. And I had one of those eureka moments where I just thought, I have to be involved with this show, and I have to just support this brilliant journalist, Warren Olney, in producing it, whatever that involves. And so I did. I volunteered at KCRW. It took a few years. It wasn't like it all happened right away because I had to keep an income coming in while I volunteered and was, got to a level where I could then have a paid job. So that's what happened. And then a few years in, I then was given the opportunity of hosting DNA because it became very evident that the LA was evolving. There was more civic architecture that started to go up in the late 90s and into the aughts, the Getty Center, the Disney Concert Hall. There was a lot of discussion about the civic realm and the architecture that was going up. And so that's underpinned the idea of DNA, which then, of course, over the years took on many, many aspects of LA design, primarily for me, buildings, but of course, many other aspects of LA design.
Right. I do love that story about how you worked to get onto Warren's show. That I think that's just a fantastic example of how you can follow something that you're passionate about and little by little work your way towards being a part of it. And that show, I came to it later than you did, but it was really my dose of sanity listening to that show for a long time, just as DNA was a weekly dose of design and joy, frankly. Shall we dive in to your 5 places?
Yeah.
Starting with what is the first place that defines Los Angeles for you?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and take a place that is incredibly new, literally hot off the press, as in the 6th Street replacement viaduct, now more, I guess, casually known as the 6th Street Bridge, designed by the architect Michael Molson with the engineers HNTB for the city of Los Angeles Bureau of Engineering, helmed by Gary Lee Moore, along with his deputy, the fantastic Deborah Weintraub, and then, of course, hundreds, if not thousands of people that were part of that team. And let me start with a little story, which is that Emmanuel, my husband, Robin Bennett Stein, and that he is quite a character. Indeed, he's one of those characters that you could call a curmudgeon. And one of those curmudgeonly things he does is basically whine and whinge about Los Angeles. And we can be driving through LA and I'm saying, look at this, look at that. And he's Mr. Grumpy, saying how bad it all is. And just very recently, we were heading to East LA and we were going through downtown and he was, moaning and whinging. And then I said, oh, the map is showing us that the route takes us across the new 6th Street Bridge. And as we approached, he literally went quiet. He just was suddenly dumbfounded, which, as you well know, is quite something. So anyway, the bridge kind of soars. I had seen it already. I'd seen it under construction. I'd seen it when it was just finished. I already thought this structure that curves in kind of multiple senses, because in plan it curves. It has this huge span crossing not just the river but railroads, and then it has these looping arches that are almost like bicycle wheels or something, or boomerangs, but these looping arches that are not all the same size and just feel like they sort of leap across. Oh, and then they lean outwards. So because of the fact that they lean outwards, and then the bridge itself elevates around this curve so you can't see the end, it has this sense of drama and infinity, and yet it's also incredibly simple and light, because there's not actually a huge amount of structure. Much of it is these sort of light loops, held by these thin, very slender cables. This bridge replaces this viaduct. People were very sad to see it go. It had been an icon in LA movies, for me, Grease, 6th Street Bridge. That was the film I saw about 17 times, absolutely loved when I was a teenager. So 6th Street Bridge had a presence in my imagination, as it did with numerous Angelinos. And so people were skeptical that its replacement could in any way upstage it. And I'm not saying this upstages it, it's different, but it's truly dramatic, and I think it's very exciting for LA to have this bridge. And last thing, it's not just a bridge, it's also a bicycle path. It's also interconnected with parks that are at each end of the bridge, currently under development. It's for pedestrians. It's a bridge for today rather than a bridge for yesterday, which was only for cars. And then, of course, actually, funnily enough, given what I just said, it instantly became attractive to the kind of people that were having races in the river in Greece. Like people that like to joyride, or whatever it's called, just completely fell for this bridge. From day one, people started racing cars up and down it. The authorities had to step in and sort of calm it down, but it was like an instant icon.
It's a fabulous experience driving across that bridge. It's almost like a little San Francisco or New York moment, right? Where you're going across an amazing bridge and towards a thriving metropolis downtown. And yet it feels much more accessible. It's like, wow, I get to have this incredible cinematic experience, but in this very kind of mellow way.
Yeah, no, that's very well put. And I did forget to mention in talking about the structure, yes, of course, there are the views from the bridge, which are much to be enjoyed when you're not in the car. If you're walking or biking, it really does become, it's almost akin to doing the boardwalk down at the beach. You've got this long stretch of, it's a linear experience, like so many great experiences in LA are, or great urban experiences. Yes, you're right. Cinematic is exactly what it is. And mellow. It is, though, both of those things. Yeah. Although it's not so mellow when a car or a scooter is like beating down on your side, because now LA youth is using it to race on. It must
be cool then.
Yes. No, instant cool.
Shall we move on to your second place?
Well, I guess since we're doing linear experiences that are available to all Angelenos, let's do another one, which is much older, and on the other side of town, and that is the Santa Monica Pier. The Santa Monica Pier down at the beach in Santa Monica, which was built, early 20th century, I think, and joins the history of Victorian and Edwardian piers that were the feature of seaside towns for several decades, places of amusement and pleasure for everybody to come and enjoy. And I've always had an affection for British seaside piers with their marvelous ironwork and their carousels and their sort of slightly sometimes down market amusement arcades, but there's kind of something appealing about them. And then, of course, they extend out there into the sea, and there you are in a way on the edge of the town or the edge of the country that you're in. And there's something calming and lovely about being out there really in the crispness of the sea air, eating candy floss and playing some game where you drop a coin in and there's some cranking metal thing that tries to pick up a teddy bear or something. I just sort of love piers, and I love the LA Pier because it has all of those things. Plus, it has a cool factor because it's been the venue. For example, I worked at KCRW all those years, and we used to do concerts there. Patti Smith played there. Cool people in sort of creatives actually lived above the carousel on Santa Monica Pier back, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s. I'm told, it may be just a rumor, that they were friends actually of Patti Smith. And then add to that, Santa Monica, which does have its reputation as kind of being not so diverse. That's not Santa Monica when you're on the pier. The pier is really everybody. And so I like all of that. So definitely Santa Monica Pier.
Beautiful. And I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to ask you for your third place.
I'm going to talk about a recent discovery. For me, not for the people to whom this place has belonged for eons. And that place is called the Gabrielino Tongva Springs. This is a place that I became familiar with in 2021. I was working on a story actually about rewilding, the bringing back of native species as a way of, enriching our biodiversity and through restoring old ecosystems. Anyway, I became aware of this place called the Gabrielino Tongva Sacred Springs Foundation. This is a piece of land, 2 acres in West LA. It's owned by LAUSD. You wouldn't even see it from the street. It's tucked between an apartment building, University High School's athletic field, and a parking lot. And then in this plot of land, you find this, how can I put it? Utterly restful pond and plants and rolling hill and birds. You are transported to the landscape of this region from before the time it was developed. You are suddenly taken out of all the concrete and all the cars, and you are transported into this little piece of our predecessors' landscape. And what's happened is that this piece of land, this foundation, cannot be used for other purposes apart from, I guess, preserving the memory of the Gabrielino Tongva Native Americans, for whom this was just one small piece of their terrain, okay, which extended far and wide. So a man named Bob Ramirez, who I coincidentally knew in an earlier life as a high-end designer builder of houses, Bob Ramirez is a descendant of the Gabrielino Tongvas, and he, in his slightly later in life, has decided that he's going to dedicate himself to honoring his ancestors, in his words. So he, as well as a bunch of volunteers and dedicated enthusiasts, and I think a board, they've all been working to restore this place that had become, I guess, full of invasive species, both in flora and fauna. And they're restoring the pond that is fed by this existing spring that just bubbles up out of the ground. They are replenishing the flora with native plants. They've brought in pungent bushes that are native to the area. It's just wonderful. It's a really magical place, and it opens up once a month, I think it is. I think it's first Saturday for people to go and tour it, help pull out weeds, catch the invasive critters, clean out the pond. It's really a magical place.
It sounds extraordinary.
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. And I would love to read your article on rewilding.
Yes, absolutely. I can share the link. Anyway, I've become, like many people, enthusiastic about rewilding. I don't myself have a huge yard in which to demonstrate it myself, but I walk around the neighborhood where many Santa Monicans have actually re-landscaped their garden using native plants, and I love them. I now wonder how we'd become so used to an aesthetic of landscaping that was so artificialized in a way,
Yes. I mean, we get used to many things and
yes.
then wonder how we got there.
Yes.
We're so far away from where we started. Oh, well, I really look forward to reading that article and to visiting this extraordinary place. It sounds magical.
It gives you a sense of what this region was like before it got built on.
Wonderful. Let's talk about your 4th place.
So, Emmanuel, that my first love is architecture, and so I have to do a building. And this is not the most original of choices, but I'm going to choose it anyway, which is the Schindler House. The Schindler House in West Hollywood, designed in 1922 by R.M. Schindler, along with the financial support and, I guess, probably design support of his tremendously characterful then wife, Pauline. And together, along with his engineer, Clyde Chase, and Clyde's wife, Marion, the 4 of them created this place, which was essentially then served as a duplex. Fascinating design, very innovative structurally, tilt-up concrete slabs, a new form of construction that he took cues from Irving Gill, LA region architect who had been testing that method himself, configured into this really interesting plan, a kind of S shapes where you wind up with courtyards both front and back, and rooms that just go one to the other, almost in a linear way. And none of the rooms really designated for a specific use. So each one of the foursome had their own kind of room, which they could fill with furniture and use as they wished. And I guess a kind of openness about how you use a space that was quite arguably influenced by Japanese design, which one feels a presence of a Japanese influence in this other quality that makes it so amazing, which is on the sides of the building that are not the tilt-up concrete with the extremely narrow, slender, pencil-thin windows. On the other facade, you have sliding screens, essentially, that give you this inside-outside connection that also feels like it may have been influenced by the Japanese, because Schindler was working for Frank Lloyd Wright at the time, and Wright was working in Japan and letting Schindler do a lot of the work on the ground. So anyway, the Schindler House is just this phenomenally interesting building that also is socially so interesting, and over the decades then becomes a place of gathering for people in the architecture community, and it becomes enveloped in its greenery, you know, these walls of bamboo and then these grassy courts that you can mingle into and out of from the interior spaces, which are odd because they're actually very low ceilinged, and you'd think they'd feel very cramped, but somehow they don't. They feel, I mean, the whole place is, it's semi-spiritual, you know. There's something about the light, there's something about the way it's immersed in its nature, even though it's been completely built around now. You know the building as well as I do, Emmanuel. It's a very, very special place.
Yes, it feels like such a little pocket of its own existence. I mean, when you're there, everything else just kind of falls away. It's like, in a nice way, it's this little bubble of light-filled space, and as you said, it feels very fluid and as though the spaces are multifunctional.
Yeah, and also it is completely, as you say, that bubble, which, by the way, is, I think, a quality to be found in many of LA's very special places, especially their houses. LA just isn't like New York or London or Paris, where you have a bunch of conjoined buildings that in a way are subservient to the larger fabric of which they're part. Those cities are the sum of the parts, whereas LA, somehow it's the parts are the sum. And so Schindler House completely has that sense of the self-contained private world. Other places also have that. I mean, I could just throw in, if we're going to just even think of modernist examples, the Eames House, you know, same thing. But also what it has is, because it became a social space for the architecture community, it has a sense of being loved in a way that is not true of all buildings, because they're simply off limits, you know. So it has a sense of being this bubble, but it's a bubble that everybody shares and sort of co-owns in this kind of lovely way. And also it offers permanent reminders, I guess, of what we like about Los Angeles architecture, which it was among the very early models of, you know, inside flowing, inside outside, interconnection with the land, borrowed light from unexpected places, you know, light coming in from multiple aspects, a three-dimensionality, the roof being used as a sort of fifth facade, and then experimental living, like the sleeping baskets on the roof, and the kind of avant-garde soirees that they would have, you know, with the performance and the dance and the poetry and the opera, and, you know, just everything about it. It's just a perfect kind of synthesis of what makes LA's design world, LA's worlds, I guess, lovely. It's so different from, say, going to New York, and it's like, where does the design world meet? At MoMA. You know, it's just different. It's just its own thing.
Very much so. That's something that those of us who love LA really love about LA. There's just such an openness to new ideas, and always has been, right? That's why it's attracted such thought leaders and such innovators and experimenters.
Yes.
And maybe some of that is as simple as just the weather allows for a lot of experimentation and new ways of living, that it's harder when you're cooped up indoors, freezing cold for half the year, to think creatively about how to use indoor outdoor space and
to be sure,
that kind
to
of
be
thing.
sure.
Yeah.
And also there's something about LA that also can be slightly illusory, because I think we all know that R.M. Schindler had this great idea about the sleeping baskets, because he thought he was now in this, sun-kissed place, which he was, but he didn't fully comprehend, it seems, how cold it could get at night. So people didn't necessarily use the sleeping baskets quite as much as he anticipated, but the very fact that he thought of it was only because he was in LA. And so I guess to that thing that you just pointed out about LA's capacity for invention and creativity, shall I
yes, please
go to number 5? And yes, and number 5, it isn't a specific place, it's a specific, I guess, phenomenon or urban phenomenon that many of us got to experience actually as a direct result of the pandemic that changed our lives, starting in early 2020, but had an unanticipated urban consequence for Los Angeles, which is the open air dining. And so you and I have just agreed that LA is this sunny and lovely place where you can do inside outside living because of the weather, and yet completely bizarrely it had a history of restaurants that didn't have outdoor patios, or had very small ones, and mostly people ate indoors in this absolutely glorious terrain. And then along comes the pandemic and the restaurants all have to shut, and many of them try and stay alive by going out onto the street, and the municipalities who need the tax base support them with allowing restaurants put up tables and chairs on sidewalks and in parking lanes and in entire parking areas. And while some have come and gone, some have actually remained. And what we've seen is restaurants just being instantaneously, spontaneously creative in making these sort of outdoor areas. And I saw it most frequently on the street that I go to most often to eat on, which is Main Street and then Rose Avenue, where I live. And from one restaurant to the next, you'd watch as, the concrete K-rails, those big concrete barriers, they would go in, and, some restaurant would just stick the tables just on top of the tarmac and maybe stick in some plastic plants or something. And then others would paint the K-rail or bring in some fabulous new planting, or bring in bamboo, or all sorts of new kinds of finishes. There was an Italian restaurant that suddenly covered all the chairs in like fake fur, so you'd feel a bit more cozy outside. And I just absolutely loved it. I loved how the spontaneous outburst of creativity, but more significantly, I loved how almost overnight LA introduced what it should have had all along, which was plentiful outdoor dining. And I'm not going to say the pandemic was a good thing, but it did produce some unintended consequences that have been positive for the city, and that is one of them.
It's interesting because LA is such a city of immigrants. And I believe that many of the places from which people would have immigrated are places where there is a culture. I mean, worldwide, there's a culture for sidewalk cafes and outdoor eating. I mean, it's everywhere. You're absolutely right. It's kind of shocking that in a city that has some of the best weather in the world, we never had that until now. At least not really. I can think of a couple of exceptions, a few fantastic exceptions, actually.
Right.
I'm thinking of the French Market Cafe on Abbot Kinney, and I'm thinking of Les Deux Cafés, which was in Hollywood, and it was basically in a parking lot, but in the most fantastic way. It had indoor, outdoor.
Right. And Rose Cafe on Rose now changed, not in a way that I particularly like, but Rose Cafe was the place in this neighborhood where we had outdoor dining. But I think that what you perceive of the people all coming from places in the world that had outdoor dining, coming here and finding it doesn't exist here. I think it may be because there were all sorts of code and parking and various kind of restraints that were in place that made it very difficult to put out that outdoor dining. And those maybe, I'd have to check the records, but I have a feeling those may be courtesy of the Midwesterners that came out to Los Angeles, very Anglo in sensibility, came out here, didn't bring that Mediterranean culture with them, brought a much more sort of indoor culture, dating maybe back to roots in Northern Europe. So it could be that's why we got to where we got, or it could be that the car just became so dominant that everything became about servicing the car rather than the person. And
I wonder if it was different originally, because I mean, if you think about even South America or Mexico, people eat outdoors all the time.
Right. I think it was definitely code that came later. And well, obviously, both you and I are speculating, but most definitely it was a bunch of code and parking constraints that contributed to, and probably health and safety. But in an unintended consequence of the pandemic, we saw this wonderful transformation.
Yes. And the history of that would maybe make an interesting little research project. But I couldn't agree more. It's wonderful to have that outdoor dining now.
Yes.
May I ask you if there were one person whom you could ask about their 5 places, who would you choose?
Well, I'm actually going to say my husband, Robin Bennett Stein.
Oh, yes.
May I?
Of course.
I thought about it after the 6th Street Viaduct revelation.
Yes. I love Robin's curmudgeonly perspective on LA, because although he talks about how much he hates it, we all know that he knows it very well. And he has terrific insight and humor.
Yeah, no, I want to put him on the spot.
Robin's perspective as a musician in LA, I think, is going to be terrific. I'll follow up with you, but thank you so much for making the time, and bike safely down the hill now.
Well, Emmanuel, absolutely lovely to talk to you, and I'll see you at one of the 5 places, ideally for lunch at one of the outdoor dining spots.
Yes, I would love that, Frances. Let's make a plan soon.
Yes,
it would be great.
To learn more about Frances's work and the people and places mentioned in this conversation, please check out the show notes. To hear more stories of the places that define Los Angeles, please subscribe. And if you're enjoying the show, we would so appreciate if you could give us a rating and a review or share it with friends. 5 Places is produced by Annalie Garakani, Quinn Wynn, and me, Emmanuel Bourlier, for the LA Forum for Architecture and Urban Design. We recorded on Chumash, Tongva, and Mikanakan land. Thank you for listening.